Okay, guys, so I don't want to make too much more content before Rage of the Abyss, but I got a few comments on my last video asking for alternatives before Rage of the Abyss and also for stuff that included the Millennium cards. So I wanted to make just one more video, I think, before we go into Rage of the Abyss format. Unless anybody else wants more pre-Rage of the Abyss content. But I think most of the changes will come from Rage of the Abyss. That being said, there still are a couple of differences that I thought were interesting enough to cover in a video. So my last video was on pure White Forest toy, and this one is going to be sticking to the same theme of trying to use power spells to lower our non-engine count, but in this case, using the Millennium cards and the Fiendsmith cards. So in most of my videos, what I like to do is take a more specific approach and give you an analysis of the things that I think are important and how you should think about deck building. So if you like this type of content, feel free to subscribe or like, and if you don't, then you don't have to. Okay, so let's start talking about what the deck is supposed to do and the reason that certain choices are here. Now, first of all, the toy cards are phenomenal cards, and they elevate this deck, the White Forest deck. So we're not talking about the runic versions or any of the other variants. We're just talking about the standard White Forest deck that plays the toy cards. If you draw the toy cards, your deck goes up a tier. If you don't draw the toy cards, your deck goes down a tier. So when you're playing just White Forest toy, the problem is you can't guarantee that you're going to draw these cards. And you don't want to have to rely on a card like Prosperity or playing a card like Desires just to see these cards more often. One of the other workarounds is thrusting for reinforcement of the army and then using reinforcement of the army to get Toy Soldier, but you can only use it that turn if your opponent controls a monster, which most of the time isn't going to happen if you're going first. And it's not really realistic to thrust for the Rota and then dump it off a White Forest effect and then add it back off of Diabel, because you were already playing to get to that point, so it would just be win more in that situation. So, to avoid you having very high variance in how good your hands are, meaning do you draw the toy cards or not, you can play different engines. Now, the Millennium cards are interesting for two reasons in White Forest. The first reason is that they can count as spell cards. So if you've played like pure White Forest with tons of hand traps, one of the problems you will no doubt have encountered is if you draw a bunch of hand traps and you have almost no spells or traps to send, then your hand can feel very, very poor, and you may just be sitting on hand traps hoping to survive another turn and be able to play. Now, obviously, it is not optimal to just turn this into a face-up continuous spell and then send it. But what you would normally be doing is you would be activating Sengenjin as a continuous spell and then summoning it to search the Golem, or Golem to search the field spell, which can place a monster in your continuous spell and then bring out the Sengenjin. So these cards, I would say, are strong on card economy. They give you access to spell cards if you need them for additional sends. And the second thing that is good about this is that these levels are quite useful for your deck. Now, before the ban list, and this is one of the biggest changes to using Millennium, is I thought that Millennium allowed you to not have to play the Centurion cards. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but there are issues, at least before Rage of the Abyss, with playing Centurion cards in this deck, where you add in a lot of suboptimal draws. Like, you don't actually want to draw Trudea or Primera. You would rather search it through your combo, like by making Auxilla and getting access to those types of cards. So I think it's unfortunate now that you can't just, for example, take this as an 8 with a level 4 tuner for a 12, and then this is a 6, for example, and one of the 6s here as a tuner to go into a 12. You can't do Calamity plays now because Calamity is banned, although it should have been banned, so that's a good thing. And since you can't do that, I was thinking, what else should you do with this package of cards? Now, regardless, I feel like Legatia is good enough to be considered playing because it's a generic 12 that gives a draw and a pop. So card advantage is always good. The whole point of White Forest is to generate card economy. So drawing one, so you get +1 card, and destroying a card so they go -1 card is very much in fitting with the theme of the deck. You don't want to be stuck on bodies that don't do anything. And so I think that there are really two uses for these types of cards. You're either going to make an extra deck play, for example, an 8 plus a 4 into a 12, or, and I think this is the most likely scenario that you're going to be doing all of the time, is if you draw Sangenjin or if you draw Golem, these cards are going to turn into Closed Heaven, and you're going to bring out Wave Hiking Caesar. I think that that's probably the correct thing to do. If you don't draw the Fiendsmith Engraver. Obviously, if you draw Engraver, you can do whatever you want. And you should probably still play the Lurry and the Tract for that reason. However, it is an option that you can main deck one Engraver, and you don't have to play Lurry, you don't have to play Tract, and you can still do exactly the same play by going into Closed Heaven lines. But Engraver is obviously a broken card, so like it's better if you do play it. It's probably best if you play 3 of them. I am playing 2 because I don't want to go above. You could play 42, to be honest. The math doesn't change a huge amount going from 40 to 41 to 42. The math starts to become more substantial once you start going above 42. I'm trying to keep it at 41 for the moment. And I'm really trying to keep the ratios of my power spells as high as possible. So 9 is like the absolute bare minimum. Because I'm also playing Nibiru, which is searchable for part of the combo, and I'm playing 2 Bestials, I don't feel as bad with the 9, but I feel like this is really the bare minimum. And so I don't want to go too much above 40, and I don't want to cut any of these cards. Now, another important thing to note is while these cards will typically go into Wave Hiking Caesar, because this is probably the most broken monster that you can go into with those cards, I was thinking, okay, you are going to have scenarios where you have like an extra 6 on the field, and the Chaos Angel requires that the non-tuner be light or dark. So even though you get to treat a light or a dark as a tuner if you want, the non-tuner does have to be light or dark. And so the Golem being an earth monster and the Sangenjin also being an earth monster, so you can't treat it as a tuner, means that these cards are not used for making the Chaos Angel. You can look at some other generic cards to make instead that still allow these levels to be relevant. Vorpgate is an extremely useful card now that Yubel is probably the best deck. That being said, I've tested Vorpgate a lot, and I wanted to try something else that I thought that could come up sometimes that you could make as a rank 6. Either because you're going to have 2 level 6s on board, like with Necroquip and with Engraver if you go through the Closed Heaven line, so instead of making Wave Hiking Caesar, or, and this actually does come up, especially if you're aware that it exists, but just turning the Golem and one of the level 6s, Arciela or Silvera, into another rank 6. Now, initially, I was thinking of Evolzar Lars, and the reason for that is, and you may also be wondering, why is there no Desiree in the extra deck? So here's the thing. If you play 3 Engraver, there's no problem. You can easily make Desiree because you're going to be cycling through enough Light Fiends for the Requiem to have enough materials to make the Desiree. And then you can, turn Requiem and something else into like a Little Knight or whatever, and then you equip the Requiem, or the Sequence, sorry, from the grave. I've been saying Requiem. You make Desiree with the Sequence, and then you equip Sequence from the grave after you've used it to link into something else instead of just doing it from the field. But the problem is, I don't want to build a deck that requires me to draw a specific card for me to use multiple extra deck spots. The one downside of combining Fiendsmith cards with a White Forest deck is you lose the otherwise extremely flexible and spacious extra deck. So I thought, okay, even though I can make Desiree and that's a good card, if I draw the Engraver, I want to be able to do the same thing no matter what hand I draw. So, and if you don't believe me, by the way, it's just because there are not enough Light Fiends. That you can't go through like the Lacrima lines because Lacrima is banned. So there are not enough Light Fiends if you go through the standard Closed Heaven route. But you can make a rank 6. I initially was thinking of Lars, to get back to what I was trying to say before, because this does something like what Desiree does. It's just that it can be targeted. So it's a quick effect. You attach both materials, and then you negate a face-up card on the field. However, I was thinking the type of card that you want to negate with this is probably not a monster card. Like, obviously you could do that because you can target any card, but you can only use this once. And I think most of the time it might be against something, for example, like an evenly matched, like if you know your opponent is siding that type of card and you don't want to lose to that. So I felt like Naruto was probably better because it would be functionally equivalent to Lars every single time that there was a spell or trap you were going to be negating and not a monster. And you already have ways of dealing with monsters, like cycling through Silvera or going for lots of your other extra deck monsters. So I felt like this was better because you could stick this on field and you would get 2 uses out of it because this only has to detach 1 material. I'm not fully sold on this, and there are other good options, to be honest. The M7 you can play as one of your other rank 6s if you want to go for the closed heaven into the Desiree line, but then you have to play Desiree and sequence. So then you can turn just a single Sengenjin or a Golem into the Desiree, but it does cost you more extra deck slots because you have to play M7 and Desiree and sequence, whereas I'm just playing Naruto for, as 1 slot instead of those 3 slots. For other options here, I think this is probably not good enough to play because you already have access to Book of Moons, but this card is an underrated card. This card, I think you could consider in a certain type of breaker build, but it probably isn't worth playing this if you're playing Dark Ruler. If we were in a format where you had to worry about stuff like Dragoon or whatever, maybe this would be more worth considering because you can turn all their attacks to 0. But yeah, I don't think it fits enough with what the deck is trying to do right now. 2 other cards that I thought were really worth considering are Fan. So this is generic. This is kind of like Cheng Ying that you would play in Runic, but you're not playing in this version. So you can attach 2 materials from this card, target a face-up card your opponent controls, and 1 card in either graveyard, banish them. I think this is a pretty strong effect, and it's a type of removal that the deck doesn't typically have. Usually the removal that you would get, like generic-ish type removal, is you go the Diabell into the Zapper Shrimp, but this is pretty situational when you would be doing something like that. I don't think that the Fan is good enough to warrant it. I think if you were not playing the Fiendsmith cards and you were playing maybe more Golem, you could kind of like shoehorn it in and you could just go for rank 6s more with like these cards and then detach the Silvera or the Arciela so you have it engrave and you have like an efficient way to cycle through stuff. The last card that I was considering for this slot is Wallow. This is still a very good card. So monsters you control gain 100 attack and defense for each card in your opponent's grave. Sometimes that comes up. Quick effect. You can target 1 card in your opponent's grave and detach 1 or 2 materials from this card, then activate the appropriate effect. So if you've detached 1 material, you return that card to the deck. Now this one is a lot more situational. It is good against certain decks. It's probably maybe okay against certain meta decks. I don't know if that would be better than Naruto against certain meta decks, but the other effect is more interesting. So if you detach 2 materials, and this is a quick effect, remember, if the target is a monster, it doesn't have to be, but if it is a monster, you can special summon it in face up or face down defense position on your field. This does not negate the effects. There's no block from this. It's not barred from attacking or anything. But if the card you've targeted is not a monster, you can set it to your field. Now that I think is a really good effect. And I think if you were playing more Bestials, maybe you would try to get another rank 6 in here. And I think probably the first card that you would cut, just because extra deck space is tight, is the Sinister Sovereign. I'm still playing this just because I want to test it more. This is one of the cards that I've been fond of in previous builds and pure builds because you can turn the Draco Berserker and the Zapper Shrimp into Sinister Sovereign, and this card is really, really strong in simplified game states. So oftentimes what happens with White Forest builds is you don't just immediately OTK, but you're controlling the game state. And if you're cycling through cards like Silvera and you're getting value off of cards like Diabell, usually if you haven't been completely shut down, you do a pretty good job of that. And I think this card gives you another opportunity for controlling the game in a different type of way. Like, you're not just booking monsters or whatever. And if you bring out Zapper Shrimp, let's say just hypothetically that you're getting full value out of this, and you send a card from your hand or field to the graveyard, target a spell or trap your opponent controls, destroy it. So you've used that. And you have the Draco Berserker on field, then you Synchro Summon after having used this effect, hopefully, ideally, and you go into Sinister Sovereign. So you're being pretty efficient with your effects, and then as long as this sticks on the field, it's really hard for an opponent in a simplified game state to play through this. The problem with this card, though, is if you're not in a simplified game state, it's very hard to justify this over other types of cards. Like, why wouldn't you just make Chaos Angel instead, for example? Like, off of the standard, just using the Diabell and the Zapper Shrimp. Or, I mean, it could also be Draco Berserker, but... Or, like, why wouldn't you consider making Satellite Warrior instead if you wanted a different type of removal to Chaos Angel? Or why wouldn't you just play a second Chaos Angel, which is something that I really, really like doing? The other thing that I'll mention that I kind of wish there was more of now that I've gone over these rank 6s is it would be really nice to have another Link monster. Appaloosa always filled that slot. Now Appaloosa is banned. If you have any ideas for something that might be worth considering as a Link monster, let me know. Obviously, another option is to play a second Little Knight, which I think is actually not a bad idea, especially because you often don't OTK immediately and you're, controlling the game. And so you may make one Little Knight and the game continues going and they get rid of it or whatever, they run over it, and then you want to make another Little Knight. That actually does come up enough to where you could consider it. So if you're looking over this and you're thinking, what should I cut? This is probably the first card to cut, but it's also one of the more interesting cards, one of the more flexible cards, and one of the least expected cards if your opponent hasn't seen you play it before. A couple other last things of note is, like in my previous video, I do think that Gallant Granite is absolutely core. You should be playing this in any version. However, what you should remember, okay, is my standard combo. I talk about how you make Gallant Granite and you search the Nib, and then you search the Veiler off of the Arciela, unless you're forced to search some other White Forest type card. The cool thing about this is this doesn't say detach one material, add Nibiru. This says add a rock monster, and guess what? Golem is a rock monster. So I really like whenever you can bridge different parts of your engine together. It adds a lot of consistency to your deck. I think it's really worth thinking about how your engines have synergy with each other and not just, okay, well, if I draw this card, I do this one thing. So I think that this card is even better in this version because you could have awkward hands, for example, where like you draw a Rusia and like a tank, or like a Rusia and a soldier, but they Veiler the soldier on summon or whatever. These type of things do happen. And then it's like, okay, what? If you were playing Baguska, do you sit on the Baguska and hope? Or maybe you just make a Diabell with nothing to add back and you're sitting on a Diabell and a prayer. But you can also just make the Gallant Granite and you can search for the Golem, and then you have more plays from there. So yeah, I like these cards. I feel like you could play more of them, but you need to remove other things from the deck. If you weren't playing Fiendsmith cards, like if you were taking out the 2 Engravers, the Lurie, and the Tract, I would probably then stick to 40, and I would probably just play more Bestials. I don't know if you really need to up this count, to be honest. I feel like there are enough of these cards in here. It's really like, it's not that you have to see the Millennium cards, it's just that you want to see either the toy cards or the Millennium cards so that you're not just playing like a tier 3 deck. Because your deck becomes at least tier 2, maybe 1.5, debatably. If you see the toy cards in combination with the Millennium stuff or the toy stuff. Okay, I think I've spoken about this enough now. Let me know if you have any other suggestions before. I've gone over the side deck stuff in my previous video, so I don't want to talk about it too much right now, but the same idea applies where you want to have as much synergy as possible. So thrust targets in evenly, debarrier, eradicator is really good against certain types of decks. You do have dark monsters. You can shotgun it in standby phase, or you can use it after you've used your dark monster effect. There are options for playing around stuff like Droll and Nib with Rafflesia. And I think Silhouette is really, really good, but I would not main it. And there's also very limited space in here. So if I was siding it, I would just side a couple stuff out that doesn't come up as much, like the Sinister Sovereign, for example, and put this in if I was going first. So anyhow, that's the video for today. If you have any suggestions, let me know. There will be a link to Discord in the description below. Thanks for watching.